You wake before dawn to a world that can kill you before breakfast. Could you survive a single day as a medieval peasant? The question is simple, but the answer is a long list of small dangers stacked together. Cold that seeps through a thatch roof, fleas and lice in the straw, a water channel running past your door that does more than carry away waste, and a legal system that can make hunger into debt overnight. Today you are not an anonymous statistic. You are someone with a name, calloused hands, and a single patch of land that must feed more mouths than it was ever meant to. Listen to the bells, smell the smoke, and walk this day as if it were your own. Dawn breaks thin and grey. Your cottage is a tight cube of wattle and daub, a low smoke hole in the roof, and a bed of straw packed into a corner that holds the heat of yesterday's bodies and animals through the night. Frost clings to the thatch. Your breath fogs the low room. Children cough in their sleep, a wet, rattling sound that has become too familiar. Your stomach twists. Yesterday's porridge was thin, boiled barley with maybe a few beans. Last week's ration of salt and a scrap of cheese are already gone. Malnutrition is not a headline here. It is a constant condition, a background pressure that makes every other threat worse. The immediate hazards are mundane but relentless. Lice crawl through hair and hems, fleas jump from animal bedding to human skin. The same thatch above your head shelters rodents that carry fleas into your hut. The floor is a patchwork of mud and straw. When you sweep, you stir dust that clings to your lungs. You draw water from the nearest stream or a communal well. The channel running along the lane does not separate clean from dirty the way you might expect. Household rubbish, animal offal, and human waste run together, especially after heavy use. Diarrhea and other intestinal illnesses are common, sometimes seasonal, sometimes chronic. A bad wet season means fields are waterlogged and dung runs into wells. A single bout of illness can reduce the year's work to nothing. You step out into the yard. Nearby, the pig snuffles through leftover grain, the hen clucks and tears at a worm. Domestic animals are a lifeline and a hazard. They provide food and fertilizer, but they keep you close to the parasites that thrive in straw and hides. Your hands are already raw from yesterday's tasks, threshing, mending, hauling. Today, you will be in the fields before the sun climbs, because the manor expects contracted days, and the village depends on you to pull your share. Morning hard labor, the hours are long and the work is cruel to the body. You shoulder a wooden yoke, bend to the plow or to the cart, lift sacks of seed, and stand for hours in the chill wind. Back pain is as ordinary as breathing. Blisters scar into permanent calluses. Repetitive tasks wear down cartilage and make even a small injury a chronic problem. The food you eat barely replaces the calories you burn. Diets are starchy and monotonous: grains, root vegetables, a little pottage, occasionally salted fish or a herring. Estimates suggest a typical peasant diet supplied fewer calories and less protein than modern dietary recommendations would suggest. Chronic undernutrition weakens immune responses and makes infections harder to survive. There are other everyday enemies. The earthen floor harbors lice and fleas, and nowhere is really clean by modern standards. Rats move freely through thatched roofs and granaries, fattening on spilled grain. When merchants bring fine cloth and spices into town, they also bring the tiny hitchhikers of long-distance trade. You might watch a trader from a port town hustle through the market, selling bolts of cloth and sacks of grain, unaware or uninterested in the mice nesting in his cargo. Close contact at markets and fairs makes these gatherings efficient at swapping goods and ideas, and tragically efficient at moving disease. If you have to go to market, you move through a packed lane of bodies, carts, and smells, curing meat, tallow, fish, and human sweat compressed by bodies pressed shoulder to shoulder. Hands pass coins and samples, hands that will reach their faces and their children's lips. Markets and churches are where the village breathes the wider world. Coastal merchants who load cloth and spices at distant ports, who sail under Genoese flags or Venetian oars, have opened channels that connect your life to the far reaches of Eurasia. Years before the mid-14th century, those same channels carried news, silver, and soldiers. In 1347, they likely carried something far more deadly, a parenthetical on origins. Modern scholarship traces the pandemic we call the Black Death to Central Eurasian steppe regions, where zoonotic pathogens circulated among rodents and their fleas, and where expanding trade networks, the so-called Pax Mongolica, made long-distance movement of people and goods more continuous. There are well-known episodes historians point to as flashpoints. A siege at a fortified trading colony called Kaffa on the Crimean coast, where reports suggest that the Mongol forces under a commander often identified as Jani Beg and Genoese defenders clashed. Contemporary reports and later interpretations suggest that during that siege, disease ravaged one side, and corpses may have been catapulted or otherwise introduced into the city. From ports like Kaffa, Genoese and other ships sailed across the Mediterranean, stopping at ports such as Messina, where within weeks and months disease appeared. Genoese galleys and other merchant ships were vectors, not because sailors understood microbes, but because rats, fleas, and infected humans rode along in close quarters. Modern estimates suggest that trade routes were crucial in turning a regional disease into a pan-European catastrophe, though the precise sequence and timing remain areas of scholarly debate. Back in your village, the church bell rings for midday mass, and the sound is not only spiritual, it is practical. Bells mark time and summon the community, but the more often those bells toll slowly and with heavy strokes, the more they can become a counting instrument for loss. Inside the parish, the priest sprinkles holy water and preaches on sin and amendment. The theological frameworks available to your neighbors, humors, miasma, astrological influence, give people ways to interpret suffering without any knowledge of pathogens. A barber surgeon can offer bloodletting or lancing. A wise woman might give herbs and poultices. A priest will offer absolution and consolation. None of these treatments are uniformly effective, and some are actively harmful or merely ceremonial. Yet in a world with no hospitals as we know them and limited trained physicians concentrated in cities, these are the options you have. If someone in your lane breaks a fever, the small signs appear in the body before they appear in the ledger. A fever climbs, the skin flushes, and if it is the bubonic form, a painful swelling appears, a bubo, usually in the groin, armpit, or neck. It looks like a rising knot under the skin and is sometimes tender enough that the patient can't lie on that side. There may be a cough, weakness, vomiting. People describe it with the vocabulary they have: sudden illness, putrid air, celestial appointments. A neighbor's child with a swelling is scooped into the arms of a frantic mother. You feel the tremor that always comes before panic. When one family gets sick, everyone begins looking at their own hands and linen. You have a few period-appropriate responses in your toolbox. Some villagers choose isolation, folding up a few belongings and slipping away to a cousin's tiny cottage in a less connected lane, or to a shepherd's hut, a primitive form of quarantine that can reduce contact with other people. Others believe in the power of procession and public penitence. Flagellants beat themselves to win God's mercy and to ward off the plague. These processions can draw vast crowds and, paradoxically, accelerate transmission. When panic spreads, so do dangerous remedies and dangerous scapegoating. Jews, who often lived in segregated neighborhoods and played a range of economic roles, became targets across parts of Europe. Massacres and expulsions occurred even as some leaders, including Pope Clement VI, issued formal condemnations of these violent acts and urged protection for Jewish communities. The violence was not spontaneous in a moral vacuum. It was part of a social mechanism where fear seeks an outlet and where pre-existing prejudices become lethal. As midday bleeds into afternoon, the manners demands reassert themselves. You are not fully free to decide your day. The Lord's bailiff inspects the common fields, Fines are assessed for neglected hedges or shortfalls in owed labor. The manorial court can rule in ways that press peasants further into poverty. At the same time, the village needs hands in the field. Harvests cannot pause for the sake of mourning. When sickness touches a family, the neighbors either step in to help or step back to preserve themselves. Many people are forced into impossible choices. Tend your children and risk the manor's wrath, or obey the harvest schedule and watch loved ones die. Crisis accelerates the visible signs of collapse. The bell that once marked liturgy grows heavy and insistent. A cart comes down the lane with its cargo of bodies, neighbors wrapped in coarse linen, a quick knot at the head, and a hand or two poking out. The parish cannot bury dozens in a day in the consecrated ground, so shallow trenches begin to appear in fields and on the common outskirts, mass graves where bodies are stacked and covered with a handful of earth. These plague pits become a recurring image of a world temporarily unanchored. They are not spectacle, but they are necessary. Burial practice changes because the scale overwhelms existing rites. In towns, civic authorities try measures that range from banning gatherings to cordoning off houses where the sick remain inside, sometimes with a red mark painted on the door and a watch posted outside. Cities like Venice experimented with lazarettos, quarantine stations near harbors, where arriving ships were kept at a distance for a time. These measures are early attempts at public health, and they have some effect, but they are not fail-proof and are unevenly applied. In ports where merchants stubbornly push for trade, quarantine rules are often skirted. Sidebar: lazarettos and quarantine. Venice is often credited with early quarantine practices. In some cases, arriving ships were required to wait in a designated area before entering port, and infected goods might be stored in isolated facilities called lazarettos. These were imperfect systems. Decision-making was local. Enforcement varied, and understanding of how disease moved was incomplete. But they were among the first institutionalized attempts to control contagion in an era before modern germ theory. Their development shows that contemporaries did try to organize collective responses, even if those responses could not eliminate the threat. When the day tips toward evening, the village's social ties fray. Trusted neighbors might be gone, having fled east or west in the hope of safety. Markets shrink as traders avoid points of known infection. With fewer hands to harvest, food rots on the stalk or in the granary. Animals are left to wander. Wolves and other predators, bolder in depopulated areas, come closer to homesteads. Lawlessness follows scarcity, theft of stored grain, desperate raids on empty cottages, and the occasional violent confrontation. Institutions that seemed immutable, parish charity, feudal obligations, civic order, start to bend and sometimes break. Let us not belabor violence or make the moment into a horror show. People mostly acted as you would expect, trying to keep their families alive, bargaining with authority, seeking cures, paying for prayers. Yet fear changes incentives. A lord short of labor might denounce fleeing peasants and seize property. A town council might lock gates against outsiders. A rumor of poisoned wells can end in a mob searching for scapegoats. All of this happens under the persistent counterpoint of ritual, prayers, processions, masses, attempts to restore meaning in a world that is otherwise unruly. You spend the late evening in a mixture of exhaustion and a new kind of alertness. A neighbor knocks with news. Another family down the lane is burying a child. You cannot help but count names. Sleep is not safety, it is risk deferred. In the night, the wind lifts, and you hear distant bells tolling with the particular cadence that marks a mortality more than an hour. In the deepest hours, your imagination turns to the worst forms of loneliness. The thought that if you fall sick in a house with no strong hands left, you may be left to your fate. Yet many nights pass with nobody leaving and nobody returning. Survival is often as much about the quiet continuities of habit as about dramatic decisions. A brief, careful sidebar on transmission. Contemporary accounts never had the language of microbes. People described smells, corruption, and physical signs. Modern science has identified likely mechanisms, rats carrying fleas that host certain bacteria, and in some cases respiratory forms that can spread from person to person. But historians qualify these reconstructions. The patterns of spread in ports and along trade routes are consistent with flea-borne and potentially pneumonic transmission in denser settings. Yet the specific mixture of modes and the way they played out in any given village remain partly uncertain. What matters here is how invisible risks interacted with visible vulnerabilities, crowded housing, malnutrition, and frequent travel. The social aftermath of a season, or many seasons of death, is not simply ruin. In the medium term, populations that survive sometimes find new leverage. When labor becomes scarce, surviving workers can demand higher wages or leave onerous tenures. For some peasants, the 14th century crises opened opportunities to renegotiate the terms of labor and tenancy. Serfdom eroded in many places over decades. At the same time, social structures that had bound communities together under a heavy lordship often reconfigure in painful ways. Art and literature respond. You see an obsession with mortality in visual culture, from dance of death imagery to sermons that dwell on the thin line between life and nothingness. Boccaccio, in his Decameron, records both the terror and the social responses around Florence, offering a literary snapshot that historians rely on as one contemporary impression among many. Sidebar: Giovanni Boccaccio's observation. Writing soon after the events in Florence, Boccaccio described empty streets, overloaded cemeteries, and an atmosphere where social norms buckled under the strain. His work is not a scientific account, but it is a vivid human chronicle that researchers use to understand how people perceived and narrated the catastrophe. It captures both the scale of loss and the ways individuals coped, some through flight, some through indulgence, some through faith. Even as you process the immediate shocks, long-term change creeps into the calendar. When harvests fail and fields lie untended, lords scramble to maintain incomes. Some turn to harsher enforcement, others offer rents to attract labor. Over years, if not decades, these dynamics can shift power toward surviving laborers and toward cities that attract migrants. The plague did not create modernity in a single stroke, but historians commonly suggest it was a catalytic pressure that accelerated trends already in motion. If you ask whether you could survive a day as a medieval peasant, the honest answer is maybe. Survival on any given day required a bitter mix of luck, healthy neighbors, relative isolation from trade hubs, and a bit of social capital. Someone willing to take you in when sickness struck. Some peasants survived the worst years by getting away from crowded towns and living off marginal land. Others perished despite minimal exposure. Individual agency mattered less than the structure of networks around you. Where you lived, who you traded with, and whether your lord enforced harsh quotas or allowed you to keep more of what you grew. The psychological dimension is important. Living with the constant drumbeat of loss hardens some people and traumatizes others. Social memory keeps images of piled bodies and ringing bells alive for generations. It sharpens religious fervor for some and breeds skepticism and cynicism for others. Communities that survive come away changed. Superstition intensifies for a time, cultural production turns to memento mori, and law and labor relations evolve. Out of tragedy come both cruelty and renewal. As dusk settles on your day, the village is quieter than it was in the morning. Fewer children play in the lane. Fewer lights shine. You prepare for sleep by stoking the coals under the pot and by tucking the animals a little closer for warmth. You listen for distant bells. You make a small list of practical tasks for tomorrow. Mend a basket, check a hedge, barter for a sack of flour, and you know that each task is bounded by the same set of unseen risks you woke to. The fragile systems that once looked sturdy, trade routes that feed cities, a church that gives meaning, a manner that organizes production, are now known to be brittle. That knowledge does not comfort you. It forces you to make choices under constraint. A short reflection. There is a temptation to look at medieval life and see only darkness, or to draw simple parallels to our modern crises. But the medieval peasant was neither wholly ignorant nor helpless. People improvised, adapted, and sometimes resisted. They sought meaning in prayer, medicine in law, and learned practice, and practical shelter in isolation. Their responses were grounded in the knowledge and social tools they had. The Black Death and its contemporaneous crises remain complex phenomena that combined biological agents, climatic factors, human behavior, and social organization. So could you make it through this day? You might. You might find an empty cottage to shelter in, or you might fall ill from nothing you did and be buried in a shallow pit by twilight. Survival was often contingent on the smallest intersections of luck and choice. What is instructive for us today is not the specific tactics that would have worked 400 years ago, but the fragility of the systems we rely on. Food distribution, medical care, civic order. The medieval peasant's day shows how a web of small vulnerabilities can, in a short time, produce a world that feels entirely precarious. If this kind of deep ground-level history interests you, subscribe for more immersive days in other eras, where we step into a person's shoes and make sense of the big forces through the small rhythms of life. For now, the bells toll once more in the imaginary village you just left. Imagine that sound lingering. A reminder that survival is rarely a single act of heroism, and more often a long sequence of tiny, ordinary decisions made under pressure. The peasant you were today did not know the microscopic causes of the danger over their bed, but they knew fear, loss, and the ache of want. Those are human constants, and they ask us across centuries what we would do when the world we depend on bends in sudden and terrible ways. If you want to continue, watch our next episode on how cities responded differently to pandemic pressures and how those differences shaped medieval law, health practices, and urban life.